Okay, so this is the last day that we're going to spend on Voltaire and Candide. So for next time, we're starting with Rousseau's On the Social Contract, right? So you're just going to read the foreword in part one, right? It's not very long. You might have a little bit more difficulty with this because it's not narrative, right? There's no plot. It's a work of political philosophy. But like Candide, I think it's something that's really important to the intellectual background of the French Revolution, and it's going to help you to understand things that are happening in France in the late 1780s, right? So we're going to be following the usual pattern here, right? You're going to do the reading, you're going to pick out a quote that you're prepared to free write about, and you'll free write about that at the beginning of class. Now, I do also want to point out that I've got some resources for you on this on Georgia View. Since I expect that you'll have a little bit more trouble like with the context for this, and he's also going to be mentioning a lot of names that will probably be he's going to assume that you know who Thomas Hobbes and Hugo Grotius and John Locke are. You probably don't, right? So what I've got here on the Georgia View page in the content browser here, if you go down to the folder right on the social contract, so I've got a couple of podcasts on social contract theory and on Rousseau himself, and also a few articles from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on social contract theory and on those three figures I talked about, right? Hobbes, Locke, and Grotius. So while you're doing the reading for Thursday, which is pretty short, it's only about 15 pages, you should also be looking at some of this stuff alongside it so that you have a better idea of what Rousseau is talking about and what kinds of ideas he's reacting to. Okay, so before we get back into Candide, so we're going to do 4 sessions on Rousseau, right, because the book is divided into 4 parts. And then after that, we're going to start working on the paper in class. Right, we're going to have an in-class writing day in the computer lab, and then you'll have a peer review day, and the draft will be due. So does anybody have any questions about anything that's coming up? Going once, going twice. Okay, everybody good? All right, great. So since this is our last day talking about Voltaire, before we start looking at what you wrote about or going kind of back into the text, is there anything that y'all want to say about this, or any questions that you have about Voltaire or about this book? Anything you found confusing or troubling or difficult?
I feel like some of the language in the book was kind of struggling. Like for example, the last session we did, a lot of the words in those chapters were probably the most challenging for me to comprehend, because it was a lot of there's a lot of symbolical meanings behind every word that I had to go back and dissect. And then most of those answers, words you did answer back in class last session. Okay.
So part of the issue you're having is just that the language is old-fashioned and a little bit difficult to decipher.
Right.
Okay. Anything else that people have had trouble with or issues with this book? just beyond the level of a little bit of difficulty in the language. Okay, well then let's start by breaking down a little bit where we've been before we finish this up. So, given our conversations over the last 2 sessions, what would you say some of the major themes emerging in this book are?
Optimism versus pessimism.
Okay. And does Voltaire seem to be clearly endorsing one of these over the other?
Not really.
So yeah, at least, up to now the jury is still out on whether he favors either of these systems, right? I think and which characters does he make mouthpieces for each of these ideas?
Pangloss and Candide are optimism.
Yep. Yeah, we've got Pangloss and Candide on the optimist side.
Martin.
Yeah, and Martin is the primary mouthpiece for pessimism, right? This kind of notion that nothing matters, there's no order to anything in the universe, right? Shit just happens, and it's mostly bad. So why bother, right? Okay, good. Other themes we see emerging here, other kind of like trends that we see in the narrative.
From Candide's side, I think for me personally, like my own personal thought and opinion about him, was that he's more like, I guess this could be a theme too, he's kind of like, in a way he was too quick to judge. Like when it came to like, stabbing people, killing things,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, there's hasty action versus, quiet reflective thought, right? We have poor Candide keeps finding himself thrust into situations that he can't think his way out of, and he always ends up leaving this trail of bodies across Europe and South America and then the Middle East, right? So everywhere he goes, he ends up hurting people or killing people. Though, as we've noted, no one ever seems to stay dead, right? Everybody comes back to life at the end of the book. People we thought were dead keep returning. But so I think, we can kind of put that up here, that Candide's tendency towards hasty action or reaction, right? Do we think that jives in some way with his education under Pangloss? Does Pangloss's philosophy encourage anybody to question anything? Everything's mechanical cause and effect, right?
Everything's like seen as it.
Yeah. Everything is as you see it. The status quo is just great. Everything's wonderful. Everything's organized for the best. So why worry, right? So when you educate someone in that system, I think kind of maybe the argument is here, they're gonna behave kind of mechanically, right? It doesn't prepare Candide for difficult situations in which he might have to make nuanced arguments, or in which things are frankly unfair. When he confronts the Grand Inquisitor and Don Issachar in Cunegonde's chambers, right? They're sexually exploiting her. When he kills the Baron, right? It's because they get into an argument about the silliness of Candide's relative low status, right? So, because he seems to be unable to actually argue against the way things are and, the beliefs of the powerful, he just reacts quickly and kills them when he disagrees. So, can we kind of spin that into something as well? Like, what have we seen here about kind of attitudes towards cultural elites? Whether we're talking about nobility or high clergy.
I think that word again is all silly and arbitrary.
Yeah. So there's definitely a kind of anti-elitist discourse that runs through the whole thing, right? That, the Baron isn't any better than Candide just because he has more quarterings on his coat of arms, right? And the church is called out for oppressing the people of Paraguay and for superstitious practices in Portugal, right? And but by the way, I don't want anyone to take Voltaire's opinions as my opinions necessarily, right? This is we're trying to read this mostly from his point of view, or from the point of view the text was written. But that doesn't mean I endorse everything that Voltaire writes or says, right? So there's definite criticism of the church. And of the nobility. What seems to determine what sorts of people get ahead in this book? What sorts of people tend to do well? What kinds of people survive and thrive in this particular world?
Religious?
Well, do they though? I mean, Candide stabs an awful lot of them.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that is true.
And they come in for quite a lot of criticism here, right? But let me put it another way, right? Does anyone's does virtuous behavior seem to get anyone anywhere? When matched up against somebody like Candide, right, whose name means honest or sincere, what sort of people tend to get the better of him all the time?
Liars.
Yeah, liars thrive, right? Liars and thieves do well here. So, we say that honesty and virtue seem to be no real defense against deception, right? Or corruption. That somebody who's pure and honest like Candide and comes from, this little backwater province in Germany, right, is no match for, say, clever city people in Paris who want to trick him out of all of his money, or, foxy Dutch skippers in Suriname who will take all of his money and then steal his sheep and leave, right? So, yeah, there's no real... And, we've also seen that other characters, like genuinely good characters, like John the Anabaptist, who helps Candide when no one else will, gets punished specifically for helping people, right? Now, again, I don't think we should take this as meaning that the text is anti-helping people or anti-being honest, right? But I think that there is kind of another thing at play here, right? It has to do with why Candide and Cacambo feel like they have to leave El Dorado, right? Now, remember back to our conversation last time, right? So why did they need to, why couldn't Candide stay in El Dorado? What was wrong with this kind of perfect utopian vision that was presented in El Dorado?
There wasn't a disagreement.
Yeah, there's no disagreement, right? Nobody disputes about anything. Everybody just believes the same things. And if you don't believe the same things they do, they seem to think you're nuts, right? And does anybody in El Dorado ever leave or go anywhere? The people of El Dorado, we're told, right, are the Incas who decided to stay put rather than going out to try to conquer the rest of the region. So it's, this nation of, peaceful stay-at-homes who are not much interested in experiencing the wider world, right? And again, why should they be? They have everything they need and everybody gets along. But one of the other big themes that runs through all of this is this experience and theory binary, right? Right, so theory, being your reliance on past knowledge and on past authority, right? So, Pangloss, for example, does all his reasoning a priori. And does everybody remember what a priori means in philosophy? If you're reasoning a priori, what are you reasoning from?
Theory.
Yeah, a priori means reasoning from theory, right? Whereas people who reason from experience tend to get on a little better, right? So I think if there's kind of one big argument that this short novel is making, right? It's an argument in favor of wide experience and letting experience guide your reasoning rather than filling your head with theory. Okay, so I think this kind of sets up where we've got to up to this point. What did y'all write about? Yeah, go ahead, Era.
So I wrote about a quote from chapter 28,
Okay.
page 81.
Uh-huh.
So my quote was, especially as I can never pronounce that word, Leibnitz could never be wrong, and besides the pre-establishment harmony is the finest thing in the world. And so is Phelan and Monterceptilis.
Okay.
Okay, so the reason why I picked this quote was because I think it was one of the biggest movements throughout the chapters of 23 to 30. Was because Pangloss was a philosopher,
Yeah.
as we know, and he was the one who stabbed the Baron, right? Correct? Was
No,
it?
Candide stabs the Baron.
Right, yeah,
Candide
sorry.
stabs the Baron.
And then Pangloss was tortured basically and dissected.
Uh-huh.
So I felt like that was one of the biggest chapters in those chapters that we read because of that big scene that happened with Pangloss, basically.
Okay.
Knowing that he was basically a philosopher, but yet all this bad stuff happened to him in this chapter.
Uh-huh. And I think that's what we need to get to with this here, right? There was an interpretation of Pangloss's belief here, right, in the face of everything that's happened to him, right? So he's had syphilis, right? He has been hanged by the Inquisition, apparently unsuccessfully. This doctor tried to dissect him, thinking he was dead. And yet, has he changed his mind about anything? Yeah, he still believes, no matter what has happened to him, exactly what he believed at the beginning of the book. right? So do we remember who this guy Leibnitz was and what Leibnitz believed? If we think back to our first session on this, this is actually really important because this is the big idea that Voltaire is arguing against in this book. Right, one of the ideas that prompted him to write it in the first place. He's German, actually.
German?
Yeah, he's German.
The German philosopher who wrote how do you pronounce that? The Odyssey?
The Odyssey, yep.
Yeah, the Odyssey about how everything happens for a reason, and this is the best world that we live in.
Yeah. So again, Leibniz is associated with the phrase, that we live in the best of all possible worlds, right? That God is all good and all powerful, so if it were possible to create a better world than this one, God would have done so. And remember that to Voltaire, this sounds like total horseshit. And that it's just a means of justifying the way things are. And, not allowing things to change. But yeah, I think that, this whole thing about Pangloss still citing Leibniz, right, after all the horrible things that he's been through. Yeah, it just kind of shows that this particular character is stuck in a particular idea, right? He can't be, however many times he's resurrected, do any of the characters who get resurrected actually change when they come back? Yeah, they're not any different, right? Pangloss is still spouting this idiocy. The Baron is still a terrible snob. Right. Cunegonde's character doesn't particularly change after she is, resurrected and rediscovered, right? So I think there's probably something to be done with this, right? We have just these kind of these almost zombie characters, right? That they can't be killed, but it's almost like the ideas that they represent can't be killed either. Yeah, go ahead, Colby.
Do you think that's a commentary on or it could be a commentary on Christians who are bad? Because baptism is supposed to be a death and their rebirth, but a lot of people stay the same, even though it's supposed to symbolize a changing of life.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, especially if we kind of connect it to other kind of currents in religious thought in the 18th century, right? So Voltaire is what we call, or what was called, a deist. Does anybody know what a deist believes, or what deism is as a belief system?
I've never heard that word actually.
Okay, this is not a familiar term to anybody?
Yeah, I've heard it, but I don't remember what it was.
Okay. So a deist is someone who believes that God created the world and then stepped back from it and no longer takes any active part in creation. So a deist technically believes in God, but doesn't believe that God has ever intervened in the world that he created, right? Basically, you build it like a clock and then set it going, right? So essentially what deists were, right, it was a safer way in the 18th century to be an atheist or agnostic, right? There was no Big Bang Theory yet, so people really couldn't come up with an alternative explanation. There was no theory of evolution either, right? So people couldn't really come up with an explanation for, how the universe came to be or how human beings came to be that didn't involve some kind of, creation myth or creation story. So deism kind of like keeps God at the beginning of the universe, but takes him out of the rest of it. And so yeah, this is the basic belief system that Voltaire espouses. And it's the belief system that a lot of Enlightenment philosophers and their followers in various revolutionary movements across Europe also espouse. So you can have a God that is a creator, but not one who intervenes in daily life or allows people to perform miracles or things of that nature, right? So I think there probably is something to the observation you made there, Colby, about the idea of baptism as new birth, and kind of showing that as many times as these characters get reborn, they never change. They're never different people. Yeah, go ahead,
I have
Ariel.
a question about the book.
Yeah,
Okay, sorry I should have asked this earlier, but
Yeah.
it just came to me.
no problem.
So, like you said, we've been talking about how every character basically comes back to life in the book.
Yeah.
Why is the reason of that? Like, why couldn't it have been like it told like just the story of each character who died and came back in the book
Mhm.
as as it happened throughout the book? Why couldn't each character have its own little story, like, and just continued off of their back versus then coming back and forth and bouncing back and forth?
Okay.
Is there significance behind that?
Yeah, and I think so. So let's try to think about it this way, right? So to what extent do any of these characters seem like well-rounded people who have like a life apart from whatever particular idea they seem to represent? Right? Like, can we imagine Pangloss, right, as a person going about his daily life? Does Voltaire give us enough of Pangloss to imagine that? And do we get enough of the Baron to imagine him as a real, fully fleshed out person? So are these characters meant to be sort of genuine, sympathetic people, or are they just kind of mouthpieces or symbols for an idea?
Yeah, I think that's more.
Yeah, exactly. So we can think of this as almost being like, there's a literary form called allegory. Have any of you ever heard of this? Okay, Colby, do you know what an allegory is?
It's related to the metaphor and symbol is.
Yeah, and an allegory really it's a text that is a kind of extended metaphor, right? Where characters or events in the text represent something else outside of the text, right? Something specific, like a particular idea or a particular historical person or a particular event, right? And I think that I'm not sure I would call this a full-fledged allegory, but I think there's something similar going on here, right? Where, the Baron is basically a mouthpiece for both the church and the nobility, and Pangloss is a mouthpiece for this, a priori theorizing cause and effect philosophy. And even a character like characters like Cacambo and the Old Woman are mouthpieces for the idea that you kind of need to trust your experience in order to survive in a harsh world, if that makes sense. And I think that's why these same characters keep coming back, right? Is because these are ideas that, even as they become outmoded or disproven, are really, really hard to dislodge from a culture, right? If you've got a culture that was kind of founded on this idea, for example, that some people get to own all the land and not pay taxes and push everybody else around, once those people become deeply entrenched, how easy is it to get rid of them? How easy is it to change the structure of your society?
It's not very easy to change.
Yeah, I mean, even if you live in a democratic society, right? It's not easy to change the basis that society's built on, right? It's not easy to change things like class structures, and it's not easy to change things, like the philosophies or religions that people live by. Particularly if, like Pangloss's philosophy, you've got a philosophy that just kind of encourages people to not do anything because everything's already great, right? It's kind of like the ultimate feel-good philosophy. It's like, even if your particular life is shit, right? Everything else is wonderful. So, right? Thumbs up, keep smiling. So, I think we only covered what you wrote about, right? We could kind of started riffing on that. What did the rest of you write about?
I wrote chapter 24.
Okay.
You will at least admit, said Candide to Martin, that these two are happy. So far I have met with none but unfortunate people in the whole habitable globe except in El Dorado.
Mm-hmm.
But as to this couple, I would venture to lay a wager that they are happy. That's sort of just a broad quote. I didn't examine it specifically, but sort of the whole chapter of 24.
Yeah.
And it basically in this chapter, he's getting tired of Martin's shit, basically. Because Martin is just overwhelmingly pessimistic.
But he's also more right about people generally than Candide is, right?
And that's what I wrote about. As they met these people and talked to them, they turned out to be miserable. And then even if they don't specifically meet these people, Martin's always like, well, they're probably miserable at home, like with the boat people. He was like, have you been to their home? Their wives at home are miserable with their wives or whatever. And then I said that like both of these outlooks are excessively toxic and radical.
Mm-hmm.
One is naive optimism and the other is ignorant pessimism.
Mm-hmm.
And both their outlooks eventually mellow out in the last chapter. This like specific section of the story right before the climax is it's like showing off both extremes.
Yeah.
And the specific example that they get into in the chapter is they meet that rich old guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he's rich, he has good food, sits in comfortable chairs, and
Right.
his two female servants are also his prostitutes. He admits that even with all of this, he is still miserable. And sort of the conclusion that one of the hidden messages in the book is that while everything is not for the best, true happiness can be found from within.
Okay. I think, I want to kind of connect that, I think, to the very end of this as well. But let's actually kind of sit for a second here. You mentioned, right, this guy, Pococurante, right, the rich guy in Venice, whom Martin and Candide pay a visit to, right? And the name Pococurante actually means indifferent or uncaring. Right, so just as is the case, right, with Candide and with Pangloss, right, the name is a key to character here, right? So Candide means honest or sincere, Pangloss means all talk, Pococurante means indifferent. And, right, this is a guy who's basically got everything, right? But does anything please him? Yeah, nothing he, whether it's the food, or the girls, or the art, or the music, or the books, right? Everything he has just bores the ever-loving shit out of him. So what do you think is going on with that? Why do you think this guy who has everything anybody could want is still bored?
It's a criticism of materials.
Okay. Can you unpack that a little bit?
It's like, because people were very materialistic in the time, like especially the elites. And the phrase, money doesn't buy happiness.
Okay. And I think, maybe there's another way we can think about this as well, right? And we can maybe connect it to the line that Candide says at the end of the novella, right? Page 87, or the very, very last sentence of the book, right? "All that is very well," answered Candide, "but let us cultivate our garden." And let's think for a second about what that means, right? That, Candide is finally genuinely happy at the end of this, right? But why is he happy? Right, if we look a little bit above this, right, the whole little society entered into this laudable design according to their different abilities. Their little plot of land produced plentiful crops. Cunegonde was indeed very ugly, but she became an excellent pastry cook. Paquette worked at embroidery. The old woman looked after the linen. They were all, not excepting Friar Giroflée, of some service or other, for he made a good joiner, as a carpenter, and became a very honest man. Pangloss sometimes said to Candide, "There is a concatenation of events in this best of all possible worlds, for if you had not been kicked out of a magnificent castle for love of Miss Cunegonde, if you had not been put into the Inquisition, if you had not walked over America, if you had not stabbed the Baron, if you had not lost all your sheep from the fine country of El Dorado, you would not be here eating preserved citrons and pistachio nuts. All that is very well," answered Candide, "but let us cultivate our garden." So, what kind of life is Candide living now?
More humble and calmer life now.
Yeah, it's more humble and it's calmer, right? But is it an inactive life? Yeah, everybody on their little farm has something to do, right? Everybody's fulfilling some kind of role. Everybody has work. And this is kind of in direct contrast to the passive philosophies of Pangloss and Martin, right? Both of whom say, don't bother to do anything, but for different reasons, right? Pangloss, because everything's already great. And Martin, because nothing can be good, right? And if nothing can be good, why even try? So this idea, let us cultivate our garden, right? What does that mean? What is the novel suggesting then about how to be happy?
That you have to find happiness, like within yourself.
And is it just finding it within yourself?
Or I guess creating it.
Yeah, you have to work at it, right? So the idea here seems to be that you find happiness through meaningful work, right? And to cultivate a garden, right? Is that a project that you can just stop at some point? What happens if you stop cultivating your garden?
Your crops.
Yeah, everything dies. So you've got a project that is gonna last your whole life, right? It's always a work in progress, but it's a meaningful work in progress, right? Now then, to get back to Senator Pococurante here, right? Has Pococurante cultivated his own garden? Did he get all of these nice and wonderful things because he worked for them?
He got it because it was given. He didn't work hard.
Yeah, everything was just, he's a rich dude who had everything handed to him, right?
Which is not helpful.
No. In fact, in some ways, he's the worst kind of elitist snob, right? Because he's an elitist snob who doesn't appreciate anything that he has. But he doesn't appreciate anything he has because he didn't work for it, right? And I think that's what that episode is doing in the novel here, right? So where it might otherwise just seem like this weird little aside where they go talk to this rich dude who hates everything, right? I think that this is meant to be taken in direct contrast to the final few paragraphs of the book. That Pococurante doesn't appreciate anything because he doesn't see any meaning in it, right? His only level of appreciation is aesthetic, and he's kind of unable to look beyond surfaces. But I also want to lean into a little bit here what Pangloss says to Candide that leads Candide to say, but let us cultivate our garden, right? Pangloss sometimes said to Candide, there is a concatenation of events in this best of all possible worlds. For if you had not been kicked out of a magnificent castle for love of Miss Cunegonde, if you had not been put into the Inquisition, if you had not walked over America, if you had not stabbed the Baron, if you had not lost all your sheep in the fine country of El Dorado, you would not be here eating preserved citrons and pistachio nuts. And I felt like it was worth it to just kind of go over this language again, right? This whole chain of clauses that Pangloss piles on top of each other, because it indicates, I think, something we've already talked about this guy before, right? However their circumstances may have changed here, right? Has Pangloss actually changed? He's still reasoning in exactly the same way, using exactly the same language, right? He's still talking about the best of all possible worlds. It's still all cause and effect, right? Even though these are things that don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. He has to link things together in this cause and effect chain. So what is different here than at the end of the book? If Pangloss is no different, who is? Yeah, Candide has changed, right? His response to Pangloss is different than it would have been back in chapter 1, right? Where he just accepted uncritically everything Pangloss taught him because he didn't, otherwise know any better, right? But experience of the wider world has actually changed Candide and has taught him to be otherwise, right? So, what about you, Shaquilla? What did you write about?
I chose my quote from chapter 23.
Okay.
And it said, there is no doubt of it, but in this country it is found good from time to time to kill one animal to encourage the other.
Okay.
I chose this one because I feel like it was just showing like authority. Like it was showing how they killed him just because they feel like he wasn't doing enough. Because they killed him just because they say that he didn't kill enough people.
Yeah, he didn't fight the French hard enough, right? Yeah. So this chapter actually refers to a real incident. So the guy who's being executed here is a British admiral by the name of John Byng. And one thing to note here is that Britain and France are at war with each other at various times, basically throughout the 18th century, right? There's maybe a period of about 30 out of 100 years when they are not actively at war with each other. But yeah, they're at war for most of the century. And so this guy, John Byng, was court-martialed and executed because it was felt by other naval authorities that he hadn't pursued the French captain he was supposed to be fighting with enough vigor. So, yeah, it's not just morbid. I mean, like, this strikes us as like pretty fucked up, right?
Yeah.
But
To be honest, this whole book is kind of fucked up.
yeah, but I think that's kind of part of the larger point here, right? Like so Candide starts in this tiny little middle of nowhere place with this philosophy of optimism, right? That everything's for the best, so why worry? And everything he learns in the world outside, right, is that like nothing is actually ordered for the good, right? And in fact, the world doesn't seem to have any order at all to it, right? The only way we get order is by imposing it ourselves on our surroundings, right? If we just assume everything's going to be great, then we're setting ourselves up for disaster.
I feel like this book has like, you would think it's this theme, and then you would think it's another theme, and then another theme, and then when you get to the end, it's like, you didn't even think that it would be that theme. So I feel like it flip-flops a lot. It's like, it kind of keeps you like guessing the theme, kind of.
Yeah, well I think like the basic structure of this book is what's called a picaresque novel. Have any of you ever heard of that before?
I've heard of a book.
Okay.
Yeah, I heard of that before.
Okay, but do you remember what it is?
I don't remember the name.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a picaresque novel is a novel that is unified like not by a single coherent plot, but by the fact that the episodes happen to the same set of characters. So I think that's a lot of I think, there is a kind of continuous philosophical line running through this. But yeah, the episodes in each chapter don't necessarily have that much to do with each other plot-wise, right? Like mostly we have Candide and whoever happens to be traveling with him, whether it's Pangloss or Cacambo or Martin, having these little kind of comic misadventures that then resolves into this idea at the end. So yeah, this is what a picaresque narrative looks like. But yeah, you're right. It kind of, yeah, and I think that this is not, it's not sloppy storytelling. This is intentional. Like it's kind of to demonstrate the absurdity of Pangloss's philosophy, and by demonstrating the absurdity of Pangloss's philosophy, he's also demonstrating the absurdity of Wilhelm Gottfried von Leibniz, inventor of calculus's philosophy. And I remind you that Leibniz was the inventor of calculus, to remind you that Leibniz wasn't an idiot. Voltaire just thought this particular line of reasoning that came out of him was, for lack of a better word, dumb. Okay. So, does anybody have any further questions about this or any other comments they want to make about it? Yeah, Colby.
I read somewhere, is it true that you only wrote this in 3 days?
I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. Voltaire was an extremely prolific writer and a quick writer, and he was also he was a professional. So this was what he did for a living. He was probably the most popular French writer of his day. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he had churned this out pretty quickly in a fit of, particularly because he is reacting to a specific event, right? He's reacting to that earthquake in Lisbon that's referenced in the early chapters. Right? They go to Portugal and the Inquisition is there. So yeah, I don't know for sure if that's true, but it wouldn't surprise me that much. Anything else? Anybody have any other questions or comments or concerns? Okay, so let me give you the reading questions for Rousseau for next time. And don't forget to turn in the writing you did as you leave.